This panel, which is the second plenary, is going to be addressing workforce dynamics. And I'm so glad that Heather shared with us that the long commutes do not help upper mobility. For those of you that may be interested in jobs, the University of Delaware has very short commutes, and we have some job openings. So now that we know that, we can begin to address other opportunities that may exist for the workforce and for making sure that we provide the stability that is needed for the middle class. With me, I have Lisa Servon from the University of Pennsylvania, who will be our first speaker. She will be followed by Harry Holzer from Georgetown. After Harry, Mark Pisano has a paper that will be presented by Joe Wholey. Mark was not able to stay and present his paper. Then we will have Carlos Asarta from the University of Delaware, who will be presenting, followed by Joe Wholey, who will be the discussant. Joe Wholey is a USC Emeritus Professor. He's also a visiting professor here at the University of Delaware. And I did forget to say that my colleague Carlos Asarta is here at the University of Delaware as well. So welcome, Lisa. Let me start with you.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and the conversation so far has been really enriching, and I hope I can add to it. I want to start by telling you a story about when I was a kid growing up in South River, New Jersey, a small town where my Polish grandparents came and worked in factories, and that I ended up growing up in too. And when we were growing up, we went to a bank that looked a lot like the one on the slide there. That's not me in the picture, but I used to go to the bank. It was called Pulaski Savings and Loan. There were a lot of other Polish people that came to South River in those days. And I would go to Pulaski with my dad on his Saturday morning errand rituals. We'd go to the barber and he'd get his hair cut. We'd go to the post office and to Mike the butcher to get our meat for the week, and then we'd go to the bank to pay bills and do other things, deposit money into our account. And I have these strong memories of that building, which was a lot like the one that you see on the slide there. It was a plain building. We'd walk over to the teller windows, and my dad, who had grown up there, always knew the teller, and she invariably knew him, and they would talk about how the football team was doing and the weather. And it felt like a community space. In all of these other places that we went to on Saturday mornings, we'd run into our neighbors and people that we knew. And when I was about 7 years old, I got my very first savings account. And I think some of you here are old enough, not all of you, to remember a passbook. How many people had a passbook when you were growing up? You have to tell the other people at your table what we're talking about. But I remember that mine was green with gold letters, and every time I got some money from my grandparents for my birthday, or later when I made money babysitting, or my first real job cleaning hotel rooms, not a whole lot of upward mobility there, but luckily my parents were able to, who were school teachers, were able to save for me to go to college. A lot of things have changed about banking since then, including the fact that it really works well for most people. It used to, and it doesn't anymore. I came to this topic, and I'm going to talk about consumer financial services and the link between consumer financial services and the middle class today, because I started doing work on this notion of whether people are using banks or not. I started off, the seed was kind of planted for me when I started looking at the FDIC's survey of banked and underbanked households, which is an every 2-year survey that started in 2009. And what the FDIC found was that about 8% of American households had no bank account at all, and another 20% were what they called underbanked. People who had a bank account but were also using alternative financial services like check cashers and payday lenders and pawn shops and auto title lenders. And what happened as a result, the policy world's concern expressed itself as a sort of astonishment and rush to push people into bank accounts. And for everybody who studies policy and those of you who teach it, you know that the way that we define a problem very much has a lot to do with the way that we try to solve it. So when you start categorizing people as whether they're banked, unbanked, or underbanked, the message clearly is there are people who are not banked enough, right? They need to be more banked. They need to get out of whatever else they're doing and get a bank account. And what struck me as interesting about that, and I am not a researcher of the middle class. I'm a poverty researcher. I study community economic development and have spent most of my career in very low-income communities. But what struck me about that was that I knew what poor people and how they managed their money. And the implication was that if you weren't in a bank and exclusively in a bank, you must be doing something wrong. You maybe don't know enough. Maybe you're too ignorant to know that you should be using a bank. And that landed on me the wrong way, because in all of my time in low-income communities, I knew that people knew where every dime of their money went. And in fact, they were more responsible with their money than people who have more of a cushion because they had to be, right? And so this implication that they would be spending so much on financial services in a way that was almost profligate or ignorant didn't really square with my understanding of low-income communities. We know that alternatives, so at the same time that I was looking at that data, I was also seeing data that showed that there was immense growth in alternative financial services, in payday lending and check cashing, et cetera. And this is one quick graphic that shows you that there are more brick and mortar payday lending stores in this country than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined. That is taking into account the fact that, first of all, hamburgers and coffee are legal in all 50 states, whereas payday loans are illegal in many states in the United States. And it doesn't take into account online lending, which is the fastest growing part of that industry. So if those things are growing so much, and we have so many people who are quote unquote unbanked or underbanked, what's going on? I really wanted to understand what was driving the demand for alternative financial services, and if the received wisdom that alternative financial services was really bad for people, what was going on? So to cut to the chase, I only have 10 minutes. I got a job working as a teller at a check cashing store in the South Bronx, one of the lowest income zip codes in the country. I also worked as a teller making payday loans and as a loan collector in Oakland, California, near Lake Merritt, another quite low income community. I staffed a hotline called the Predatory Loan Help Hotline that was run out of the Virginia Poverty Law Center to hear about people's stories. And then I interviewed hundreds of people who were customers of these businesses, people who were taking out payday loans, people who were going to check cashing, many of whom had bank accounts or had in the past, to really understand what they were doing and why they were doing that. And what I found out was really interesting. A lot of things that I don't have time to tell you about today. But whereas I thought that I was doing research on poverty, I ended up finding out just how many middle-class Americans were using these services. And in fact, at one point I got hold of a data set of customers from a subprime credit bureau. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a subprime credit bureau. We think of Equifax and Experian, but there are these other credit bureaus floating beneath that lever that are showing alternative financial lenders the creditworthiness of those borrowers, and found that middle-class Americans are the fastest growing group of payday loan borrowers. People who own their homes, have a college education, make $50,000 or $60,000 a year. And that was one of the most shocking, surprising things that came out of my findings. And it squares with a lot of the things that we've already heard today, that more than half of Americans could not come up with $400 in the event of an emergency. I'm sure most of you have heard that statistic. It doesn't mean that you don't have $400 in the bank or under your mattress or wherever you keep it. It also means you don't even have people you could ask for it. You don't even have that in any liquid way. You don't have a network of people or anything that you could cash in. And I think that's a shocking statistic. That means it's even worse than the idea that so many of us are living paycheck to paycheck. But when you talk to people and when you see the populations that's using these services, you wouldn't really know that that's what's happening. So I want to tell you a few stories that came out of my research, because I think it's a really good way to sort of put flesh on the bones of a lot of the statistics we've heard. I want to tell you first about a woman named Krista who lives in Central Florida, and I interviewed her 3 times over the last few years. Krista's a nurse's aide at an assisted living facility. She has an associate's degree in nursing and 10 years of experience working at that business. She earns less than $12 an hour and has not gotten a significant raise since 1990. She also works 20 to 30 hours of overtime each week, but still finds it hard to make ends meet. Interestingly enough, the last time I talked to her, which was just about a month ago, this is a funny story. First she said she'd been let go from her job. And the reason was she was accused of being negligent in her duties. She worked the overtime shift, the graveyard shift, with one other person for an enormous group of elderly people at this facilities. And she was accused of negligence and let go, which is interesting when you read about how poorly staffed a lot of these facilities are. She talked about, even before this happened, how impossible it was for her to do her job. So she had to turn to payday loans in order to pay for everyday expenses. She said the cost of everything keeps going up, but wages didn't. And when we talked about this notion of the American dream, which I think of as a shorthand for what middle-class life is supposed to be like, you know, owning a home, saving for retirement, being able to save for your kids to go to college, she said it's a lie. There's no help for people like me. Teresa, her story hinges on medical debt. Teresa's from Dallas, and she's also worked for more than a decade in a public sector job. We talked a little bit earlier about how public sector jobs are not paying what they need to. She worked for a truancy court as an administrator and often worked in a shoe shop to make extra money. She's a single mother of 2. And she had health insurance, as many public sector jobs come with. But between the time that she had her first child, during which she had to pay a $50 copay for everything, and her second child, the insurance changed so that her copay, her deductible was $3,500. She couldn't afford it. She had to take out payday loans. But from the outside, it looks like she's stably employed. She said, I've got to have tires, but I didn't want to disappoint the kids. That was the first time. Her car was breaking down. She needed it to make all these visits for truancy court, but Christmas was coming too. And even though she thought she'd be able to pay it back right away, she said things didn't work out because life just kept happening, and that's the way life is. I'll tell very shortly the story of Anna, who works for a large hotel chain, made $10,000 to $15,000 on commissions, and then the commission formula changed. She no longer has that extra income, had to move in with her extended family. When we look at what people do, they often realize that payday loans aren't so great and they stop using them. But Krista, for example, got out of debt by cashing out her 401k plan entirely. Those things are happening all the time. What's changed, I think we know from what people have said this morning already. And in conclusion, I just want to say a few recommendations that we need to shift the conversation from thinking about who's banked and unbanked to thinking about financial health. We need to ensure access to safe and affordable financial services, which many Americans do not have. And we have to focus on these big problems like a living wage and health insurance. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Harry Holzer, as you know. I'm a labor economist, so a little bit like Heather, but slightly different focus. And I'm going to focus today on the labor market. The labor market is where earnings are determined, people's earnings. Earnings are the single biggest determinant of who makes it into the middle class. And the issue I want to address is of the roughly 1/3 of Americans who, by almost any definition, are not part of the middle class, what are the policies right now that could help bump some of those people up in a sort of very practical way? Like any economist, I think a lot about supply and demand, where supply in the labor market are the workers and the skills they bring to the market. Demand is employers and firms and the skills they're looking for and how they compensate them. So I've done research on this for 35, 40 years. I think there's problems on both sides of the market that I want to talk about a little bit. Now, the single biggest determinant in America today of who makes it into the middle class is education. And people who have a BA are almost guaranteed to make it into the middle class over time, over some point in their lives. I want to focus mostly on the sub-BA folks, many of whom can still make the middle class. But I think the biggest problem on the supply side of the market right now is that too few of those people are actually getting the skills and credentials that the labor market values. And there are a lot of sub-BA credentials, associate degrees, and certificates that the labor market values. But a lot of folks don't get them. And on the demand side of the market, I think the biggest problem is that employers are not creating good jobs. And if anything, the quality of the jobs are getting worse over time. And employers can still make a lot of money while creating bad jobs. So let me focus a little bit on each of those. On the supply side, we send a lot of people to college in America, because it is so heavily rewarded, compensated. But if you look at that kind of sub-BA stratum, completion rates are extremely low at community colleges and for-profit institutions. Completion rates are in the ballpark of 20 to 30%, depending on whom you're looking at. A lot of the credentials that people get, if you get an associate's degree in general studies, not a lot of labor market value to that. Having done a lot of research in this area, I think there's problems on the student side of the market, but also on the institutional side. On the student side, a lot of folks are going to community college with really quite weak academic skills. They didn't do really well in high school, and they got out of high school with a diploma, but not a lot of the kind of skills you need to make it even at a community college. And other issues, people who have to work full time and therefore to support their families and therefore have a much harder time actually making it through a serious academic program. There's problems on the institutional sides too. And we ask our community colleges to wear so many different hats, an academic hat, a workforce hat, several others. We give them quite few resources with which to do that. A lot of our most disadvantaged students go to those institutions, and the resources simply aren't there for the institution to provide the supports they need, the counseling, things of that nature. But I also think the incentives aren't very strong either for them to really expand the areas that the labor market values. The community college is going to get the same tuition and the same state subsidy regardless of what people study, regardless of whether they finish. And the fact is, a lot of the high demand areas, healthcare, IT, advanced manufacturing, the costs of that stuff is very high. The equipment changes every couple of years. The instructors are expensive. So the incentives aren't really there for the institutions to expand a lot of that stuff, rather than the more traditional liberal arts, which in many cases are cheaper to offer. So I think there's resource issues, there's student issues, and institutional issues. Among employers, what I think right now is the biggest problem, they're not creating these good paying jobs that they might have done a few generations ago. And by the way, I'm gonna not talk about issues of race and gender and how employers deal with that. Those are very important issues. I'm happy to talk about those during Q&A. But right now, employers for decades have been fighting unions tooth and nail and winning those battles. That's a problem. But there's new issues coming up that I think that are troubling. First of all, a lot of employers are embracing what we call low-road practices and policies. Because it turns out within any given labor market, you can compete with what we call high-road practices, really investing in your workers and in their skills and in their productivity and performance, or you can go low-road. Just minimize your labor costs no matter what it takes. Don't worry so much about high turnover and shoddy work and things like that. More and more employers are figuring out how to make a lot of money going low-road. Secondly, the labor market is fissuring in a lot of places. That's a new term by David Weil, who used to work in the Obama administration. Under the same roof, people have all different kinds of employers. Some of them work for temp agencies, for contracting agencies, et cetera. That lowers the incentive of the employer to invest in their skills and in their productivity. And finally, employers are gaining more power in the labor market and are engaging in a set of anti-competitive practices like non-compete agreements, non-disclosure agreements, which are really anti-competitive, and really hurt the performance of the market as well as those workers. So I think those are the issues to really focus on if we want to move people up fairly quickly into the middle class. And then these additional problems as well. A lot of people are in distressed regions in the country, rural areas, small metro areas. Think of the industrial Midwest, where Donald Trump had a lot of support after manufacturing jobs disappeared. In addition, there's a set of barriers that keep a lot of people out of the labor market. For some groups, especially African-American men, criminal records might be the single biggest barrier they face. But for other groups, opioid dependencies that we've heard a lot about in the news recently, I think, are a major problem. And I'm going to mention one other thing, not as popular among progressive audiences. When workers often do a calculation, are they going to be better off in an unattractive labor market or on something else like disability insurance, increasingly they're picking disability insurance. I'm not saying everybody on this, I'm talking about folks that are right on the margin, trying to choose between the two of them. I think we need some disability insurance reforms to sort of rebalance while we make work pay more and give people the skills they need. So on the education and training side, what are the kinds of things I'd like to see? I would like to see really something like a race to the top for community colleges. Really inject some resources into this layer of education, but target it at expanding the high demand areas, the healthcare preparation, IT, et cetera, while you also strengthen the incentives. And a lot of states are going to performance incentives, not always the right way. I want to see these places put a lot more emphasis on the earnings people have after they leave, and especially the earnings in our lower income and minority communities. And I think if you create more of those incentives, the schools will respond and use those resources correctly. We should do a lot more on the front of apprenticeships and sector-based training. Sector-based training is based on partnerships between industry and community college that often feed workers into those high-demand industries. We've got to get a hold of the for-profit industry. There's a lot of, their numbers are much weaker. They're getting more and more students, and contrary to what Betsy DeVos is telling you, they do need to be heavily regulated. And finally, pathways to success, starting in high school, high-quality career and tech ed. There are nice models of career and tech. They're nothing like old-fashioned voc ed with tracking and all that that I think could do a lot better. So that's all aiming at the education, skills, and supply side. On the demand side, besides the things that progressives have been talking about for a long time, protecting collective bargaining, moderate minimum wage increases. By the way, I'm not a fight for 15 guy. I'm more of a fight for 10 or 12 guy. Because I just worry at 15 we'd lose a lot of jobs. We can talk about that too. But I really want to see America embrace a high road employment strategy and find new creative ways to reward employers who take the high road and who invest more in their worker skills, who share their profits, et cetera. This could involve changing the tax code to give them credits. This could involve technical assistance. It could involve the federal government creating a high road jobs fund and then giving grants, competitive grants to states who form their own strategies depending on what their local economies look like. As Heather said, I'm a strong believer in working on models of universal and portable benefits. That would help a lot with that fissuring problem we talked about. And I do believe we need a new set of regulations and again, I worry about the heavy hand of regulation on the labor market. I am a markets guy, but I think these non-compete and non-disclosed agreements really need to be reined in. Massachusetts and some other states are doing that and showing us a way forward in that. I think that's a good thing. Besides that, addressing a few of those other issues I mentioned before, these distressed regions. And what economists have always said about that is, well, people will move to where the jobs are. Don't invest in places that are declining. Problem is that's not happening much. People like us do move. People with BAs and above do tend to look at the national market. People with high school degrees and below tend not to move. Their social ties are very strong. I do think we have to start experimenting at least with investing in those regions, subsidized jobs, infrastructure investments, et cetera, to try to boost things there a little bit. But on the barrier side, we got to address the scourge of criminal records, and we got to address opiates. I don't know that we know that much yet about how to do with opiates. We're going to learn a lot soon. The best thing you do about criminal records is not lock up so many people. Okay, and we could have many changes in our sentencing policies and to do that. But of the folks who already have criminal records, we could also do a lot more to connect them with, especially in a tight labor market. Right? I mean, this is the time when we ought to really be bending over backwards because employers can't get enough workers, and they're more willing now to overlook a criminal record, which they're not willing to do in a more of a slack labor market. So we got to step up our efforts to connect those workers, make the case that they do have some skills employers want, and work on that. And then the last things, since I do believe we need to reform disability insurance, think of disability insurance. You have an incentive to take people out of the labor market forever. And I think in a lot of these distressed regions, a lot of workers have gone that route, and they're miserable because spending 30, 40 years of your life on disability is not a great way to live. It doesn't give people great self-esteem and not to mention the loss of income. We need to incentivize workers and employers to stay in the labor market and for employers to accommodate this disability. And I think there's proposals to reform disability insurance that could do more of that. I think we need to try them, to pilot them and evaluate them. Let me also be clear. I'm in favor of reforming some of these income support programs. I don't support the simplistic work rules that states are now imposing in Medicaid and food stamps that I think will do vastly more harm than good. You can think about reforming these programs, but still a little bit sensible and evidence-based, and that's a very ideological direction. So I'll stop there and pass it on to other folks, and thank you.
I'm going to read this. Yeah. I'm Mark Pisano. I'm teaching right now at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm asking Joe Wholey to read my remarks. I'm Joe Wholey. Good. So Mark says the following: in America, we fretted over Y2K at the millennium, but totally ignored one of the most significant transformations that has impacted our country. Simultaneous dramatic drop in the fertility rate of women from 3.8 births per childbearing women to 1.9, and at the same time an over 7-year increase in longevity. So we have fewer working age people and more older people. All these changes occurring globally have not previously occurred in recorded human history. Given the goal of this conference, the impact of these demographic transformations is at the core of the problem. And Mark says the solution is to rebuild the middle class by providing opportunities for all Americans, resulting in lowering the political discord that we are experiencing even today. So the cause, he says, simply put, and I hadn't heard this mentioned before, although Mark talks about it all the time, 2/3 of the growth in the economy is derived from growth in workers, and the other would relate to productivity growth per worker. But growth in the working age population is going to be 55% lower in the coming 30 years than in the last 30 years. We are developing a significant workers' gap. In the last decade of the 20th century, in the Clinton years, we added 23 million working age people. In the first decade of this century, we added 9 million working age people, contributing in part to the Great Recession. In the current decade, we will add just 5 million people, and in the 2020s, working age population growth could be even lower. Recent immigration policies are significantly adding to the reduction in the working age population, adversely impacting the most significant issue facing our country. No wonder our national growth rate dipped substantially over the past 18 years, almost half the growth of the preceding decades. Additionally, the much lauded unemployment rate of 3.9% is a direct result of not enough working age population. And I should throw in also a lot of working age people who've chosen not to be part of the labor market because they're on DI, disability insurance, for example, or sitting home playing computer games on their computers. So he says our lack of understanding of the importance of growth in the number of working people and their skills explains the long and slow recovery of the past 10 years and portends troubling clouds for the future. Help Wanted will be the most frequently used ad of the future. Hoping the economy will grow by just using expansive monetary, fiscal, and tax policies alone is wishful thinking. And he repeats, the Goldilocks decade of the 1990s was the result of rapid growth in working age population, coupled with a very small increase in population over 65 years. That decade benefited from a substantial demographic bonus. Analyzing the economic impacts of these age impacts shows that workers earn more and consume more and pay more taxes. Older populations have just the opposite effect, economic effect. They earn less, consume less, and pay fewer taxes. Since the millennium, Summing these age changes for the millions of people in our country generates a demographic penalty, a reduction in the growth of income, consumption, and taxes paid by individuals. If the Clinton demographic profile of 2000 existed today, GDP growth would be 4.5%. What's missing in our current policies is a focus on people. We need every able-bodied person to work, including retirees, who will comprise 2/3 of the population increase in the country. Automation will not save us. Robots cannot simply replace people. Robots are not consumers. Since consumption is 2/3 of economic growth, loss of this demand force on our overall economy could be catastrophic. Technology by itself is not the answer. What can we do to alter the economic and ultimately political course of this demographic transformation? Douglas North, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, argued that when the economic path you're in does not work, change the rules of the game. Change the way that organizations in the society work together to alter the path. For the worker age issue, the key is how do we organize ourselves so that no one is disposable and everyone's part of the economic system. There are over 20 million people who, for multiple reasons, penal, transfer payments, dropped out, not properly legalized, etc., are not in the labor force right now, and who could be. Add those over 65 who could work longer, and develop a strategic immigration framework. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what we could do if we organized ourselves differently. The essence of this approach is creating a culture of understanding that all Americans are interdependent. We need all Americans to be part of a work culture. Our beloved Pope Francis suggests that through work, we provide for ourselves and serve others and give ourselves the dignity that others have spoken about earlier today. How do we create opportunities for work? Take infrastructure as an example. Provision of infrastructure to regenerate our existing systems and build for the future becomes possible if we alter the way that our governmental units as well as our sectors work, particularly the private sector. If those who benefit from infrastructure investments and increased wealth provided by zoning changes, for example, become part of the funding equation value capture, then the financial limitations stalling these efforts can be overcome. New infrastructure funding authorities, we have them in a number of states, where public-private partnerships can be put together, and you can also capture non-tax money to help you do what you need to do, so that everyone wins. Fix the airport, rebuild the roads, etc. New infrastructure funding authorities could rebuild our aging roads, bridges, and transit. More importantly, the supply chain infrastructure networks, ignored for over a half century, can increase our production and distribution capacity. This will result in opportunities for all throughout the country in red and blue states, creating opportunities in the entire country. In conclusion, the strength of this nation is our people and the flexibility and strength of our governance system. So let's use these assets to address the problems that we face as a nation. North is suggesting that we change our way organizations work together, governance, and focus on using all our people in an interdependent way. Public-private partnerships and a people focus built this country. If we use these strengths, we will overcome the workers' gap and the demographic penalty facing us. In doing this, we will rebuild our middle class. Thanks.
Thank you.
Our
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk to you. I do have an accent, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, but I am an immigrant here from the University of Delaware and another economist. So you're getting a few of those. Just a great opportunity for me to be here. My father is here, and my father's a retired major general from the Spanish Army. And so he provided for us opportunities that made it so that I went to high school in France, and then without speaking any French, and then came to the U.S. with a swimming scholarship without speaking any English. And I know by the time we're done, you're going to still think that I don't speak any English, but I'll try to make you change your mind on that. But many opportunities, and the fact that growing up, we struggled to make it to the end of the month. So I think I grew up in a middle-class family. I remember my dad always doing numbers at home. And so I can tell you that while I was not born in the 80s, I was born a little before that, I do know that I make more money than my dad made when we were growing up. So I guess I'm one of that 50% that has been able to beat their parents in terms of the income that came forward. But what I do here at the University of Delaware as my secondary appointment, but really what I do the most is focus on personal finance, economic and entrepreneurship education. And what we do is we train teachers in the K-12 system on how to teach that properly. This is just an infographic that you can see, just to let you know that last year we did more than 100 trainings for teachers, taught more than 2,000 teachers, and reached over 100,000 students. And so as I was thinking about the presentation, trying to figure out what is the middle class. I think I grew up in a middle class family, but what is the middle class? I figured quickly that there is no such thing as a definition for the middle class. You ask an economist, we're going to be looking at income, at economic resources. You ask a sociologist, they're going to be looking at the type of jobs that you have. Some people look at culture and how you perceive yourself. So this is an article that just came out a couple of days, looking at the data is not from 2 days ago, but the article is 70% of Americans consider themselves middle class, right? There are people who may be earning $20,000 a year and they think they're middle class. There are people who are earning $200,000 a year and they think they're middle class. All right, and so what I did is I went to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, a great resource. I make my freshman students go there. The first day of classes, they have to write an assignment that first week, because there's a difference between what they think they want to do and what they actually end up doing. It's really important for them as freshmen to say, I want to be this in the future. How about I get some information about what the expectations are for this type of job? So I went out and I just found 5 jobs that I think fit what we would think is middle class. So you have high school teachers, you have information about the median pay, typical entry-level education, and so on. And you're going to see why I'm doing this. So this is high school teachers. Here is police and detectives. All right, you can look at the median pay, $62,960. Here's registered nurses, all right, about $70,000. Also different levels of education and so on. One more for you, plumbers. All right, $52,000 median pay. The distribution clearly is quite dispersed, but the median pay is $52,000. And I have interior designers, $51,000. And of course, all of them have a job outlook, which I think is really important for people to look at. What is going to be the demand of what you want to do in the future? But the question I have for you here and for myself is, what do they have in common? And the reality is that they don't have a whole lot in common. You can say, well, the median income is pretty similar. Well, I would argue that having $50,000 a year and $70,000 a year is significantly different. You could say, well, the level of education is somewhat similar. I would argue that having a high school degree and having a college degree is significantly different. And if we're looking at trying to move people from or to the middle class, one thing that we can do and we should do is encourage them to get an education. This comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, clearly showing that there is a strong direct correlation between the level of education and the median usual weekly earnings. That's not us as academics saying it. This is data that actually shows so, and that there's a strong negative correlation between the level of education and your chances of being unemployed. So they don't have a whole lot in common, but they do have one thing in common, them and everybody else. And that thing in common is that we have to make personal finance and economic decisions daily, regardless of where you are. And that's where I think the importance of when we get people to the middle class, the upper or the lower part of it, are they able, do they have the tools to not only contribute to their own futures, but also the futures of the nation? Because how they do is also going to affect us, all right? So they'll have to be making decisions about asset building, budgeting, credit, housing, investment, and so on. That's what they all have in common. And that's what we do at the center. We try to focus on making sure that we train individuals on how to properly approach all of these decisions. And so what I would like to propose is to make sure that we start early teaching students about personal finance and about economics. There are many people in here who have taken an economics class, and I am certain that if I ask you, how was your economics class experience? Most of you are going to go, no good. And I know that because I travel a lot. I'm fortunate to have a textbook with McGraw-Hill on principles of economics. And so I get a chance to do that, like most everybody here. And when people ask me, what do you do? And I say, I'm an economics professor, their typical response is, right? That's the typical response. There's no other way to go about that, all right? But what we need to do is start early and provide those tools. So a couple of statistics for you for the middle income households. This is one from the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center, and they were looking at the National Financial Capability Study, and what they actually report 30% of middle income households are unable to come up or struggle to come up with $2,000 in 30 days. And when they do, they tend to rely on friends of the family or coworkers or somebody that they know to get that money. That also correlates with the level of financial literacy. Here's another one for you from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. 35% of all households have no money saved for any type of retirement. And I understand that you're thinking, well, before we can teach about all these things, people have to make the money, they have to have disposable income and so on. But 35%, and for those who do have retirement savings, the median amount is $1,100, all right? If my TIAA craft email that I get every so often is right, apparently I'm gonna need more than $1 million to retire. What are you gonna do with $1,100? If they're right. I don't know if they're right. I've read some research looking at a couple that retires needs about $280,000 for retirement. It seems like a low number for me, but I don't know where people are. It's difficult to determine that, plus long-term care. So what we propose is that we have to teach economics and personal finance in the K-12 system. We have a program here in Delaware offering 28 high schools in Delaware offer. It doesn't mean everybody takes it, called Keys to Financial Success. And we have done academic research showing that it is effective. So there are a number of papers, but let me show you what we teach in this class. We teach about goals and decision making, about careers, about budgeting, about savings and investing and credit and housing and so on. We make high school students think about this before they get to college so that they know the types of decisions that they have to make and that they are informed citizens when it comes time to make the decisions. Think about these decisions. I'm going to tell you that in some states, and somebody might probably get upset at me at this, we require, in the K-12 system, education about organ donors. And that is important. It's extremely important, but you only have to worry about that once in your life. This you have to worry about every day of your life, all right? And so we've demonstrated that it is effective, that it increased through publications, that it increased the knowledge of students in personal finance. And some people tell me when we go out and we try to fundraise to continue to do this, they say, well, it's the knowledge. How do we know that the knowledge then translates into actions? And so there's research out there too as well, looking at mandates to teach personal finance in different states, and the idea that they improve credit scores and that the probability of delinquency for young adults goes down. Why don't we teach students about credit scores? What affects your credit score? What impact is going to have the decisions you make today if you want to get a mortgage? Because when you're 16, you're not thinking about that. But if we can show you the difference between having a credit score of 760 to 850 and 620 to 639 on what you would pay on interest in a 30-year mortgage, I think that's important. It's impactful. It's something that you will remember. And you may not remember exactly all of the details, but enough to make you think about it when you're making decisions. We look at gender as well. If we can teach it in the K-12 system, there is enough research out there showing that there's a gender disparity when it comes to personal finance and economic knowledge. That seems to be eliminated when we tackle the question in the K-12 system properly. And then we look at age too. I get this question all the time. Well, students are too young to learn about this stuff. No, they're not. We have research showing that if they're freshmen in high school, the freshmen have less personal finance knowledge and economic knowledge than the seniors entering. But at the time they're done with the course, they have exactly the same. There's no significant difference between them. And we should start even earlier than then. All right, what are we doing in Delaware? In Delaware in 2018, we just passed the K through 12 financial literacy standards in the state that are going to have to be implemented in the school system. And as you can see, the Delaware Center, the University of Delaware Center for Economic Education and Entrepreneurship is being charged with actually developing the materials and training the teachers in the state. We've been doing this for over 46 years. So we're very proud of this. It's a first step. It's not the final solution. The solution that I see is that we require students to take it. Not that we offer it, not that we mingle it in the curriculum, but that we require them. And so what are some of the things that we're doing? All right, because you're thinking, an economics class, right? An economics class. Can we really teach economics to kindergarten kids? Yes, we can. And yes, we do, actually. So we have a program like Economics for Kids, where we take readings for students, develop lessons that may talk about savings, for example, or allocation of resources, and then provide the lessons to the teachers to do them in the classrooms. We have meaningful economics competition, knowledge, and entrepreneurial thinking. We have something called mini society, where students create their own societies in the classrooms, their own businesses, their own currency, and then they sell products to each other and understand the importance of competition, for example. We have something called Teach Children Save Day. This is like when I was a little kid, and I don't know how much time I have, but in Spain, we had the dentist come every year to the school and tell us that it was important to brush our teeth. And to this day, I brush my teeth every day, once or twice, typically twice. All right? Exactly the same thing. We partner with the community. We go in the classrooms and we explain to students with the lesson the importance of saving or any other personal finance lesson. We have the stock market game. 1,486 students from 324 teams participating in a 10-week program where they have $100,000 of virtual money and they get to invest it, learn about the companies, their returns, and so on. We need to do this early. Nationally, I'm not going to go into details here. All the white states are states that you're not required to take a course in economics to graduate. We have people here who have never taken an economics class yet. You're in panels where I'm an economist, I talked about economics, and so on. All right, this is for personal finance. All of these states that don't require you to take a personal finance course. And so as I conclude here, and I was trying to put the presentation together, and I look at the charge, which I may have modified a little bit, to engage in public policy and service, to ensure that the American middle class prospers and continues to be relevant, what I'd like to propose is that we need to make sure that we provide the middle class and all students the tools to be successful financially, not just for them, but also for everybody else in this nation. And I would go further to say that the University of Delaware could be one of the first institutions to require every graduate to actually take that course. Because if states in the U.S. are not doing it, maybe we have a chance to do it here at UD in college to require a course on personal finance. All right, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. So, Joe, we have been less disciplined in the budget group, I'm sorry to say.
I'd like to thank Lisa and Harry and Mark Pisano and Carlos and Carlos's father. Where is he?
He is right there, sitting in the back. So there he is.
So here are a few things I gleaned from the 4 papers. However we define the middle class is financially insecure. Our working age population is not growing, and too many are not even in the labor force. Education in economics, personal finance, and entrepreneurship is important. What should we do? I had put the word encourage in, but Harry's word is we should spur community colleges and employers to help workers increase their skills and credentials. Incentive systems for the community colleges to do a better job in credentialing. Okay. Mark Pisano had talked about infrastructure funding authorities. They have them in many states, but I think simpler to say public-private partnerships can be used to draw in non-tax money to rebuild infrastructure and to actually rebuild parts of American communities. We should reform our disability insurance programs to incentivize workers, and we should encourage people to have the dignity of a job. Pope Francis had said that giving people money is okay as a short-term solution, but everybody needs a job for their human dignity. Can't always use money. Money is tight. Use regulation to raise the minimum wage. I had incautiously written down to $15 an hour, but I crossed that out. To 10 to $12 an hour, but raise the minimum wage, and also expand earned income tax credit programs, which that's my favorite program of all. Democrats and Republicans, federal government, state government, so forth, like the earned income tax credit program. It makes sense. And reform the disability insurance program. I said that. Did I say that already? One more, to help people work, we need to expand child care as well. So different ways that we can help people to be in the labor force and to be contributing members of our society. And to put it in Mark Pisano's words, we are all in this together. We all need to be in this together. And that sounded to me also like the Vice President talking this morning. We all need to be in this together. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one or two questions. Anybody have a question for the panel before we go into our plenaries? Yes, into our discussion groups. Go ahead.
Oh, yes, thank you. Do you see a link between protecting consumers and the increased financial well-being of middle-class workers? If yes, what entities would be best suited for this role? And I'm particularly interested in hearing your response, considering your past role on the advisory board to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was fired last spring by Mick Mulvaney from the Consumer Advisory Board of the CFPB, which was an amazing experience being on that board. But yes, I think consumer protection is really important for two reasons. I could say a lot about it, but what I will say as a short answer is that what I didn't go into is how much more complex consumer financial services have become. And so it gets to your point, Carlos, about financial literacy and kind of being able to wade through that. But it also gets to being protected to make sure that people know what they're doing when they're signing on to a product. And it's hard to wade through that now. The other thing that I think is really important about consumer protection is that it has kind of created, both created a way for people to know that what the services that they're using are, have passed some sort of a test, and also to make sure that other actors aren't entering the industry that would be doing people harm. So I think the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was doing a terrific job with that. My up-close experience of serving on that board for 2.5 years was that there were really smart people in that agency who were really trying to do the right thing, and the director, Cordray, was also running a great organization that was returning money to people, that was pushing hard on the complaints that consumers raised. And I worry that, you know, it took from the Depression to the eradication of Glass-Steagall basically decades to kind of return us to that unsafe era that before the first crash. And now we've gone from the crash of 2007-8, only 10 years, when we've really kind of chipped away at Dodd-Frank. And the agency, is the CFPB, it's a concern that it's becoming completely defanged. Sure.
One last question.
Thank you. Dr. Holzer, I was interested in some of your policy recommendations, and in particular, the race to the top for community colleges, and perhaps as it relates to policies in distressed regions, and wondering if you're seeing a couple of models in these older industrial communities where this is happening in a way that where you can see a shift in the labor economy in a positive way? Thank you.
It's a good question. I haven't looked that carefully at those regions, at the community colleges in those regions. So there are models out there. I think of them less as being in distressed regions and more as being in certain states where the education and workforce policies are creative. And not to leave any states out, but I think, for instance, about Kentucky, especially under Governor Steve Beshear, was very good at doing apprenticeships and supporting advanced manufacturing and training people for very good paying jobs in advanced manufacturing. I think of Tennessee, which has actually done a very good job of luring manufacturing companies from Germany and then having a set of creative policies in place to train them. South Carolina, very interesting, you don't often think of as a state, but actually South Carolina is expanding its apprenticeship. They pay a $1,000 tax credit per head for every new apprentice, and very heavy marketing and technical assistance to employers. So there are states that are doing interesting and creative things, and what I always believe in doing is looking at all these state experiments and also how they're using accountability and incentives and evaluating to see which models work the best for which groups of people, and then on that basis maybe trying to figure out what would best serve. But the problem with those distressed regions is that they're so weak on the demand side of the market, on the job side, that any strategy that's only about skills is not going to do a huge amount. I think they do need, whether it's infrastructure or other ways to build more demand, subsidized jobs, and then in combination with the skills policy, I think, and again, we can experiment and then evaluate like crazy, create jobs for all of us in the room who are social scientists, and then try to learn really what works best.
I just wanted to say one other thing that I forgot in my initial answer, which is the other thing that's really changed is the need for financial credentials to participate in the economy and civil society, like a credit score. So, you know, my parents, there were no credit scores back there. Now it's really critical to get a job, to get housing. And one of the things the CFPB was working on was whether the formula, the FICO score, whether that really works for everybody. I think there's a lot of evidence that it's biased in favor of certain kinds of Americans. It doesn't take into account, for example, whether you pay rent or not. And so thinking about those new requirements for financial citizenship, those become a barrier now.
Well, thank you so much. Let's thank our panel.